Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jason Marzek. I'm the director of the Latin America Center's Economic Growth Initiative. Thank you all for joining us today for this incredibly timely discussion, and I'd actually call it a celebration on the importance of the U.S.-Mexico relationship. There's a lot of misinformation out there about Mexico and what it means for the U.S., and it's time to put the facts on the table. I'd like to thank the many impressive speakers who have taken the time to join us for such a critical moment. Secretaries Michael Chertoff, Carlos Gutierrez, Tom Ridge, Ambassador John Negroponte, and Jay Shamba of the Council of Economic Advisors. Jason Firm at the last minute was called into a meeting with the president. Thank you all very much for joining us. We're also delighted to be joined by Adrian Arsh, the founder of our center, who's sitting here in the first row. As all of you know, and as that round of applause shows, her vision and inspiration are helping to reframe thinking about Latin America. Thank you, Adrian. Today we have a great event, but this is also the launch of a larger effort, our Why Mexico initiative. The United States and Mexico are strong partners with a relationship that is unparalleled and indispensable. From security to trade to immigration to culture, our two countries benefit enormously from a highly integrated partnership. But this relationship is under attack. The presidential election has put Mexico in the eye of a national political storm. The country is being wrongfully blamed, in fact, I think scapegoated, for the anxieties many people have about how the world is changing and what it means for them. Rhetoric is calling into question the benefits of strong commercial relations with an important ally and proposing unilateral action at the border to combat unauthorized immigration. But the kicker for all this, 6 million U.S. jobs depend on trade with Mexico, and net migration with Mexico is now below zero. This type of rhetoric has angered our Mexican allies, alienated many American citizens, and worried friends of the possibility of protectionist and confrontational policies becoming a reality. So as a Latin America Center dedicated to promoting the transformation in the region, and as the Atlantic Council, an institution committed to promoting constructive engagement, it is our obligation to launch an initiative to highlight the importance of this bilateral relationship. Now, this is unusual for a think tank, especially a nonpartisan one. But as you can see from the speakers here today, this is not an issue that falls along party lines. Discussions about our southern border must be responsible and grounded. And that is the purpose of this initiative, to show why the U.S.-Mexico relationship, one oftentimes taken for granted, should not only be defended, but should in fact be broadened and deepened. So today we've launched a major social media effort. You can find us on BuzzFeed, and we'll also share with you a video between the two panels that we've made. In the coming months, we'll continue to highlight the importance of this relationship across industries and across regions. And we hope you'll join us by sharing our work on social media, contributing your own opinion pieces, and spreading information far and wide. So today we have two excellent panels to highlight some of the most critical elements of the U.S.-Mexico relationship. The first on national security, moderated by Mary Jordan of the Washington Post, and the second on the economic relationship, moderated by my friend and colleague Peter Schechter, director of the center. So there'll be plenty of time for Q&A in each of the panels, so feel free to start teeing up your questions, and also feel free to get out your phones, but only to tweet. And when doing so, remember to use the hashtag #WhyMexico. Of course, this event is on the record. Before turning it over, I'd like to thank our partners who made this event possible. New York University, George Washington University, SAIS, Baker McKenzie. Miguel, I'm glad you could join us here today. Our media partners at the Huffington Post and at AEM, the Asociación de Empresarios Mexicanos. Particular thanks to Amy Glover for her help with outreach and inspiration behind this event. We are grateful for the support of our partners and find their enthusiasm reflective of the broad support we found for this initiative. With that, I'm thrilled to turn it over to Mary Jordan, a national correspondent of the Washington Post who is covering the presidential campaign. I'd like to welcome her and her distinguished panel to the stage. Again, thank you all very much for being here today.
I'll let you guys go ahead. I think I'm on the end here.
Good.
Well, even for such a timely discussion, we have an enormous amount of firepower here. So I'm delighted, especially when we're talking about facts. As I run around the country on this campaign trail, there's not a day or a rally or an event where Mexico doesn't seem to come up. And yet there is an enormous amount of misinformation and a lack of understanding. So I want to introduce our panel here. We have Governor Tom Ridge, who of course has extensive coverage in US government. He was a member of the House of Representatives, of course, governor of Pennsylvania, and the first ever Secretary of Homeland Security under George W. Bush. And today he runs Ridge Global, an international cybersecurity advisory firm. And we have Secretary Michael Chertoff, who succeeded Governor Ridge. Before that, when he was running Homeland Security from 2005 to 2009, he was a federal judge, as well as an assistant U.S. Attorney General. Now he runs the Chertoff Group, a risk management and security consulting firm, and he's also senior of counsel at Covington and Burling. Ambassador John Negroponte is a veteran Foreign Service officer who served in many key diplomatic posts, including the ambassador to the Philippines and Iraq. And for our discussion today, very importantly, he was ambassador from our country to Mexico. He was also the first ever director of national intelligence, and he currently is the vice chairman McClarty. So, before we start getting into the nitty-gritty and some of the most interesting aspects of national security when it comes to Mexico, I thought I would turn to our former ambassador and just ask him to talk kind of more broadly about the U.S.-Mexico relationship and maybe answer kind of a key question that I hear out there in Ohio and Pennsylvania about really how does Mexico affect the ordinary American?
Right. Well, thank you very much, Mary, and thank you to Adrienne Arsht and to your center here for hosting us to this, what I think is a very important meeting. And let me just start with a sort of a resounding yes to the point that Jason made about the importance of the relationship. When I was Deputy National Security Advisor under Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush was elected, and I was asked what post I wanted to go to, Mexico was my first choice. I was delighted to get it, and it was just a fabulous experience. It was the period during which we negotiated the North American Free Trade Agreement. Let me say that U.S.-Mexico relations since really for almost 80 years, ever since Dwight Morrow and Josephus Daniels, who was Franklin Roosevelt's ambassador to Mexico, have generally been good. They were good during World War II. They were good in the ensuing period. Closer to the present, I think generally the cooperation has been better in the economic area, and we all know about you asked about how the relationship with Mexico affects American lives. Well, since the signing of the NAFTA, trade with Mexico has quadrupled to the point where we have $550 billion worth of two-way trade between the countries. We do something like $1.4 billion of trade with Mexico every day. There are literally hundreds of millions of border crossings. Mexico is the largest single destination for American tourists. Just to give you a few examples of how our daily lives are effective. As I said, the economic relationship has generally been good, particularly since 1985 when Mexico joined the GATT. And that is what ultimately led to Mexico's decision to be willing to negotiate a free trade agreement with us, which went into effect in 1994. Security has generally been a little bit more neuralgic issue with the country of Mexico for reasons of sovereignty, for reasons of history, and so forth. And I guess in recent times, in my memory, the low point was the so-called Camarena case when DEA agent Camarena was murdered by Mexican drug traffickers, probably with the complicity of the Jalisco government back in 1985. And that left a hugely bitter taste and a lot of baggage and history to overcome there. But I think we've managed to work our way through that in the ensuing 30 years. And there's some things about security cooperation that are really quite remarkable if you think of them in the context of Mexican history. I just cite one example, the willingness of Mexico to extradite drug traffickers and other kinds of traffickers to the United States. During my time, the idea of a extradition of Mexican nationals to the United States was just a complete non-starter with the Mexican government. And there are levels today of cooperation between the Mexican military and our military that, again, would have been unheard of 30 years ago. Even small joint exercises, common communications facilities along the border. So that the issue of U.S.-Mexican relations is no longer just reduced to one simple question: which American general would come to the annual National Day, the Grito exercises in September? That used to be the big thing. Who are we going to send down there? Well, today, it's a much more complex and cooperative thing, and I think along with the NAFTA, the economic improvement, and improvement in these other forms of legal cooperation, things are just reached a very, very high and I think comfortable level of cooperation between the two countries.
Well, that's perfect. I would turn to Secretary Chertoff to talk about the breadth of this security relationship. I think a lot of people don't quite get all the lines of communication. You want to just begin this discussion about, and maybe tell us a few things that might surprise us.
Well, I think John is right. I mean, over the years, our cooperation has gotten better. Now, there's no question that Mexico does have a serious problem with organized criminal drug cartels. That's more a problem actually for Mexico than for us, but both countries suffer. And there are some capacity limitations on Mexico's ability to investigate and prosecute those people, although they have begun a process of reforming their prosecutorial and judicial system to make it more efficient for them to bring those cases. And as John pointed out, they've now increased their willingness to extradite to the U.S., so that's been very important from a cooperation standpoint as well. We've shared intelligence about what goes on our common border, and maybe even more important, we have worked with the Mexicans to strengthen their capabilities at their southern border. You know, the idea that most illegal migrants in the U.S. are Mexican is just complete hogwash. The very significant number come from Latin and Central America. They may come through Mexico, but that doesn't make them Mexicans. And in fact, Mexico is as interested as we are in finding a way to manage that flow and prevent people from trying to sneak in and then putting themselves at the mercy of these smuggling organizations and criminal gangs. So we've been working with the Mexicans on their southern border. Finally, one of the things I used to hear all the time was, well, we're worried about terrorists coming in through Mexico. And I can't think of a single instance when I was secretary for 4 years that a terrorist came in through Mexico. And in fact, we had quite good cooperation with Mexico in terms of, again, identifying people who might be coming into the continent that might be potentially terrorist threats. In fact, oddly, the neighbor where we have seen terrorists come in over the land border is Canada. We had Rassam in 2000 who was caught by a border inspector. We've had other instances over the years where extremists have come in through Canada, but actually none that I'm aware of through Mexico. And again, that's a tribute to cooperation. Now, I'm not saying the situation is ideal. The issue of these criminal gangs is a problem for both countries. We have to acknowledge, in fairness, we are partly responsible for this. We create the marketplace for drug consumption, and that is at least a portion of the economic fuel that allows these drug cartels to flourish. But I do think we're making progress in cooperating.
So, Governor Ridge, even though we haven't heard, there were a couple cases. I was just in Mexico and I talked to a couple of the former presidents of Mexico who said, you know, we've been giving tips and there have been some instances where we have stopped people coming in. But when you look at that border, what are the most important tools that we have that make that border secure? Is it drones? Is it intelligence? Is it eyes on the ground? Can you just give us kind of a surveillance of security on this incredibly long border?
All of the above. I mean, that's exactly what it is. I mean, you got 2,000 miles. We have almost 700 miles of fence, and people say we need 2,000. No, as Secretary Chertoff knows and the people in Mexico know, there's fence, the easily accessible areas, but you can't put fences in mountains and things of that sort. So it is about triangulating drones. It's about human intelligence. It's about intelligence exchange between, electronic intelligence exchange between both governments. And also, if I go back to those early days in the Department of Homeland Security, it's interesting that the Atlantic Council has this conversation into two segments. One's like the security portion and then the economic portion, but they're really integrated if you think about it. And we've been blessed as a country to have good neighbors to the north and good neighbors to the south, and we have to do whatever we can to preserve that. But I remember in 2001, even before the end of the year, before we even talked about a department, President Bush said, we need to sit down with the leaders of both countries and develop a smart border agreement, a smart border accord, where we can integrate our mutual interest and collaboration on a secure border, but also make sure it doesn't impede the flow of goods and services across the border. So when it comes to security, I think it's pretty well embedded. It's intelligence sharing, it's drones, it's from 10,000 to 20,000 Customs and Border Protection agents. I mean, that security is fine, but I think one of the unsung relationships that has proven to be pretty valuable to both countries is the Sentry program, where we pre-screen individual Mexican citizens coming back and forth across the border, and the FAST program is Fast and Secure Trade, where people agree to a certain compliance regimen in the supply chain, from the manufacturer to the warehouse to the driver to the ultimate importer, and they get through a different lane to expedite the trade. So from day one, the relationship, I think, has been, okay, it's in our mutual interest to preserve a secure border, to try to manage that risk as best we can, but let's do it in a way that doesn't impede this extraordinary trade relationship we have.
So
and one other comment real quick. I think Secretary, I got a threat matrix every day, 5, 6 days a week. Some days it'll be a couple pages, some days it'll be a couple dozen pages. I can't think of a single time when the intelligence community, when I was there, ever suggested on any single occasion we had a problem with a potential terrorist crossing from our friends in Mexico.
Now, why is that, given the length of the border? I mean, why not? Why are they coming in through Canada or somewhere else?
So some of it is, and I don't want to knock Canada, because the Canadians are great partners and we've shared a lot of intelligence with them. But there were communities in Canada that had come in over the years from parts of the world which did in fact become radicalized. And these radicalized communities did attract some people to come in, maybe with generous asylum. And some portion of those people wound up becoming potentially threatening to the US. So in other words, there was a tendency for the communities themselves, because of their makeup and history, to be potential launching pads for admittedly a small number, but still a non-trivial number of terrorists. Mexico didn't have that. There wasn't really a significant community there, people from parts of the world where radicalization was taking place. And again, as Tom said, we had a good sharing relationship with the Mexicans, including sharing visibility into who was coming in from overseas and traveling in, so we could help each other out.
What do you think of the wall, the famous wall? I mean, if you build a 2,000-foot, 50-foot wall, do you then just build a 51-foot ladder? I mean, what do you think of the wall?
So, I think the wall is one of a number of tools, but it's like, if you have an axe, you don't use an axe, for example, to hammer a nail into a wall. You use a hammer. You got to use the right tool for the right job. We built 700 miles of wall, and we built it principally in areas where the distance between the border and either a town or a highway was relatively short, and the idea was to slow up people coming in illegally so they could be intercepted. It doesn't make sense to build a wall in an impassable area or in an area where there's the Rio Grande is wide. Other tools are more important: surveillance, intelligence, unmanned aerial vehicles. And actually, one of the most important tools is what we do inside the country. Many of the people who come to the country illegally, and again, most of them are not Mexican. They come from other parts of the world, including other parts of Latin America. Most of them are coming to work. And if people are willing to hire those who don't have work authority or authority to be in the country, that's going to be a huge magnet. So dealing with that issue of employment becomes important. The second thing, sadly, is more and more of the people coming from Latin America are fleeing violence and failed states, as we see in certain parts of Central America. It's the same thing that drives a lot of people out of Syria. If we don't address the problem at its source and try to help the rule of law regain a footing in Central America, people are going to continue to flee because their lives are at risk.
Before we talk about Central America and what will make things safer, I just want to quickly, since it's so much in the news, quickly just hear about, what do you think of this big giant wall that we keep hearing about? Does it make sense?
You just real hard not to be too political, but I prefer presidents that tear down walls rather than build them. That's just a political point of view. And I think the sad thing about it is everybody's been running away from the notion that if you had a truly integrated system where men and women from Mexico and Central and South America come back and forth across their border pre-screened, you wouldn't need more than 700 miles of fence. You wouldn't need an additional security member. You wouldn't need another Customs and Border Protection agent. We don't have a means where people can lawfully go back and forth. And I think it's a little arrogant for Americans to think that every Mexican or somebody from Central and South America that wants to come to this country wants to come here to be an American citizen. That's not true.
And the fact is, migration has been steadily dropping from Mexico.
But there's also a lot of misinformation, I think, about the number of illegals in this country that have Mexican heritage. I think we've heard estimates that almost half of them flew in lawfully and they stayed. And Michael and I tried to build an entry-exit system. The government gave us money to build the entry system, but we're sitting on millions and millions of fingerprints and photographs of people who came here. We never checked to make sure they left. So I want to go back to this whole wall thing. I mean, it's almost like a diversion from a really important and difficult issue, and that is, how can we, with a neighbor, develop a sophisticated system, probably based on biometrics, where people can come back and forth across the border. It's like taking Sentry, put it on steroids. And if we did that, you don't need the wall. But it's like, the easiest thing to do is just say, I'm going to build a wall. I don't think you want to build a wall with a neighbor.
Do you want to weigh in on this?
Well, just first of all, there's a lot of legal Mexican migration to the United States, family reunification, people who are petitioned for by their relatives. I remember back in my time, and I think it was for that decade going forward, about 100,000 people a year gaining legal entry into the United States, getting their green cards and eventually citizenship. So we mustn't forget that. So I think, and there's another reason you want a wall or a protection from people coming in that way. It's dangerous out there, and you don't want people, these terrible stories about dozens, if not hundreds of people getting killed coming across one way or another illegally. We want to have some kind of orderly system between the two countries, and that would include, I think, as Governor Ridge said, some kind of mechanism where people can go back and forth and can also get employment. The guest worker, the Bracero program was not a bad idea. The German guest worker program is not a bad idea. And by not having that kind of program, by abolishing it in 1965, when LBJ did under pressure from the AFL-CIO, what happened was there was no way for a Mexican to come and work here and then freely go back to his country, because they had the fear of having to go through the whole process of getting back across the border illegally again. So what did they do? They stayed, and then they eventually brought their families over. And so we actually, by canceling the Bracero program, increased Mexican migration to the United States. I'm convinced of that.
So in an era when millions of people cheer the idea of a wall, maybe because of not understanding the whole issue, what are some other solutions with the goal of making it more orderly? You're talking about a new guest worker program. What can we just talk about some solutions if the idea is to make this that's doable in this climate?
Yeah, so there are a lot of things you need to do. You need to look at this as a system, and I think both John and Tom are right that in some ways we've created our own problem by making it so difficult to come back and forth that those who get in don't want to leave again. And let me also say that you can't build a wall high enough that there's not a ladder to go over or a tunnel to go underneath. And some of those tunnels are really sophisticated. So here's what you do. First, you look at, I think promoting economic development in Mexico and other parts of Latin America helps keep jobs there. I think establishing rule of law and order in parts of Central America stops people from fleeing for their lives. Having a legitimate guest worker program that satisfies the needs of American employers, but gives people the ability to come and go with proper identification and proper tracking, answers two needs: the desire of people to work and the desire of employers to have workers. And experience shows that if you create that kind of a program, most of the people coming from overseas or from another country don't want to permanently settle here. They want to work and they want to go back. So I think these are some of the things we could do if our leaders were honest with the American people about how to solve the problem, instead of coming up with something that sounds like a nifty slogan but actually makes no sense at all.
Could I just add one? I don't know if you'll agree with this or not, but enforce our immigration laws too, domestically. We used to always treat this as just a border problem, and it's not just a border problem. It's a domestic labor problem.
Absolutely.
Issue.
In talking recently in Mexico to Vicente Fox and to Felipe Calderon, they were talking quite emphatically about how important it is to have a good relationship, just overall, with the U.S. president. Just wondering, I don't think people tend to think they have that much leverage, do they? I mean, why does it matter that whoever's in the White House actually gets along with the president of Mexico?
Well, I think in the world of geopolitics, establishing a good personal relationship, a trusted relationship, a respectful relationship, understanding that sovereigns will have their differences, but in that trusted relationship, you try to minimize them and really focus on the things that are your mutual benefit. And I think one of the challenges, and nobody said it here, but I will, again, I'll be a little bit different. I think the Mexican government, if we had a better relationship with them, could do more and should do more in terms of helping us with the flow of illegals. There was a Meridian initiative, I think it's 08 or 09, when Congress said we will spend, I think, $2.3 billion to support the Mexican government's effort to deal with the contraband running, the drug runners, in particular to help with the emigration through the southern border. So I think a good, constructive relationship, on a real personal relationship between leaders of any two countries,
it does matter.
I think it matters immeasurably.
Now, you brought up Central America, hot issue here. And a lot of people are saying, you know, President Obama is working with Mexico on the southern border of Mexico because a lot of the immigrants are coming through Central America. But you have a lot of human rights people that say they're fleeing, you know, kind of horrible lives. Do we have the right policy there? Have we hit this right that we're supposed to be so harsh in turning them back, using Mexico to turn back Central Americans at the border of southern Mexico?
Well, I mean, I think the suggestion has been made that we have to have a holistic policy. It's dealing just with the migration issue isn't going to get there for you. You've got to focus also on what's going to make Central America better. I'm sad to say, as somebody who was ambassador to Honduras in 1981, 35 years ago, that the situation in Central America today, particularly in the northern tier of Central America, is far worse than it was 35 years ago in many, many respects, particularly because of the gangs. So I think we've got to help them. And frankly, I think it's an area of potential collaboration between us and Mexico to help make things right down in Central America.
I think we have time for a couple audience
Can I just say one thing? I want to
too.
just put an exclamation point on that. This is a classic example, I think, where America doesn't necessarily have to be, nor necessarily should be in the lead in trying to improve the relationship with Guatemala, Honduras. Their neighbor, Mexico. So if you have that kind of relationship that I talked about, that trusting relationship, you work with your friends and allies in Mexico to help them do what they think is necessary
So you think
support
Obama
those
is
economies.
right to be working with
It's got
Mexico?
to be, John pointed out, it's got to be a collaborative enterprise. But America doesn't have. We should be supportive of our friends in Mexico, whether it's economics, whatever it is, as they deal with their neighbors.
Okay,
It's in our
so we
interest to do
have
so.
time for a couple audience questions. If you just raise your hand and say who you are.
Jose Lopez with the Mexican News Agency. Oh, sorry. Jose Lopez with the Mexican News Agency, Notimex. Could I get your opinion about Mr. Trump's idea to deport 11 million Mexican immigrants if he gets to the White House? And secondly, President Obama, President Peña Nieto, and Prime Minister Trudeau are meeting on Wednesday in Ottawa for the leaders' meeting. Is there anything that you think the three can accomplish that hasn't been done in terms of security, of a better relationship in North America?
So to take the second one first, I mean, I attended a number of those meetings. I found that they were very useful, again, particularly in promoting sharing of intelligence, common economic policies, things of that sort. On the first, as I've said publicly, I think it is delusional to believe you're going to deport 11 million people unless you repeal the Constitution and put everybody to work as a immigration inspector. So, I mean, I think it's nonsensical. In fact, again, as I think John said, if you enforce the rule against employers who employ people illegally, you're going to have a far greater impact, and it'll be a legal way to go about it, than if you somehow suggest the fantasy that you're going to round people up and send them back.
Yeah, I just want to add something to that. I think the notion of identifying and sending back is delusional. It's a bumper sticker solution, but it's never going to happen. Secondly, if there are 11 million here, probably only half are from Central and South America, the other half, so that narrows it down. But if you're here and you're focused on the Mexican border, those who've come here illegally, by and large, came here to work, to add value, and they have. So my view is that you simply create again, it's part of an overall immigration package, and I don't like the sequencing. When people say, well, we got to do this and this first, and then we sequencing it, I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. I think we can have stronger enforcement, but I also think that we could create a separate classification to legitimize their presence. We don't have to make them citizens, but if you brought in 100 illegals here who hadn't broken the law, who were raising their families and added value, and you said, look, we got to get you out of the shadows. You could help us with your neighborhoods. You could do a lot. You're doing some good now, but we want you to be visible.
Do you think Congress could
we
pass
said
that?
you could be a resident, but you can't be a citizen. 99 out of 100 would take it.
You know, I think Congress could pass it. I was involved in dealing with this issue when I was in office, as was Secretary Gutierrez. We spent a lot of time on this. I think that a majority of members of Congress could get on board with something along the lines of what Tom said. And I think if you poll consistently the American people, my experience is 60 to 70% support this. I know there are some people who are passionately and vocally against it, but the reality is that if you look at what the majority wants and what makes sense, if you want to fix the problem, doing exactly what Tom says, which is having a structured way for people to work, legitimately come out of the shadows, pay their taxes, pay their Social Security, is one of the best tools you have to reduce the amount of illegal flow that otherwise comes into the country.
Go ahead.
I can speak without the mic.
No, here it comes.
Hi, my name is Simone. I'm a student with American University. We're talking about the immigration issue, which naturally comes up when you're speaking about the Mexican border, but I wanted to know if there were other issues that we should be thinking about when it comes to national security. You briefly mentioned the Mexican cartels. You've also briefly highlighted economic concerns. I was just curious if there are other national security interests we should be considering.
I jump in with one there, which is, and it goes to also the leaders' meeting, which is about to take place, and I think probably all three of us attended these tripartite meetings that took place once a year. I think the whole question of the opiate epidemic in this country, since Mexico is a source of opium, and I hope the leaders agree to try to ratchet up the efforts against the flow of those substances. I don't know what the chances are of success, but I think that would be a worthy area of some additional dedicated effort.
Yeah, I agree, and I think the cartel issue and the issue of transnational crime, which is not limited to Mexico, but is a serious issue in Latin America and other parts of the world, needs a lot more attention, because these organizations really challenge the ability of governments to manage their own countries. So they do pose, in my mind, a national security threat, and something that we have to, again, have a collaborative interest in working to prevent.
I meant to say heroin.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Who really wants to ask a question? Okay. Go ahead, right there. Oops. Okay, these are the last two. Okay, go ahead, and then we'll get to you. Who's got her hand up?
Great. So first of all, I wanted to thank you for, I'm Francisco Alvarez with the Roosevelt Institute. But I'm also here as a Mexican citizen, as a U.S. citizen, wonders of North America. First of all, I want to thank you for the theme of the conversation. I really think it really should go without saying, but we do need to build a narrative that Mexico and the U.S., our economies are very closely linked. We're among each other's biggest trading partners. And this narrative about jobs going to Mexico and leaving the U.S. actually is a very incomplete picture. Mexico's high-end manufacturing industry is actually bringing a lot of high-value, high-paying jobs to the U.S., and I'm more than glad to cite some examples individually. But I want to move away for one moment from the very positive picture of the integrated North American market to talk a bit about firearms smuggling into Mexico. According to data from the Government Accountability Office from 2009, 2014, about upwards of 70,000 firearms that were...
They're going south, right?
Yes.
Okay, so let's
going
talk
south.
about that.
And
Thanks
so,
for that
and a
good
lot of them
question.
are illegally,
Right.
but also legally acquired. And so, can you
Right.
speak to
And
how
that's
we can
actually
address
a big issue in Mexico.
the
Right.
southward movement
And
of
does-
firearms? Thank
does-
you.
Thank you. That's an interesting
I thought
question.
he made a statement. I didn't hear a question.
So he's just talking about an issue in Mexico right now.
Well, it is huge. The southward flow of arms and also bulk cash have both been big issues, and steps have been taken to try to improve it. And we have this e-trace mechanism and all of that. But it's very hard because it is illegal to export a weapon from the United States without a license. But it's not illegal to buy one, and you get one and then you send it across. And it's very hard to enforce that.
Right here. Yes, you had a question. Right behind you, sorry. Thanks.
Hi, thank you. My name is Elaine Peña. I work at George Washington University. And I really appreciated your discussion of solutions, and especially thinking about a holistic policy. So my question is, how can we account for the strengths and limitations of each port of entry? That's to say, is one border policy towards security, towards immigration, towards trade going to work across all 2,000 miles? Or is there a way that we can think about each port of entry as playing a specific role in that project? And also, if that is the case, how are we going to get municipal, state, county officials on board? Thank you.
So let me start. Obviously, I think you're quite right that there are different economic and personal issues that apply to each of the ports of entry. That's separate from what goes on between the ports of entry, where, of course, obviously we want to stop people from coming across without, proper authorization. I think we can do a number of things. I think, as Tom pointed out, programs that pre-screen and identify people who are regular travelers help speed things along. I think, frankly, our infrastructure at many of the ports of entry is outmoded, so you get those very long lines. That makes it very difficult. It's economically costly. And there'd be a real value in increasing the capacity of each of the ports of entry. I think modern technology gives us more and more capability to track who's coming in and to match that up with respect to what we need to know about people before we admit them. So I think if we applied all of these elements, we could have a more smoothly flowing set of travelers moving across the ports of entry. We'd be more secure, and we'd actually produce economic value, particularly for those regions that are basically adjacent to the border.
We're running out of time, but I wanted to ask you one final thought is, following on what you said, there's been a lot of talk about improving infrastructure on the border, about getting better technology that would help both the economic side and national security. So let's look out 5 years from now at the national security relationship between Washington and Mexico City. Right now, it's pretty bad. I mean, I think on the street, there's just a lot of rhetoric. There's a lot of parties in Mexico, and they're not saying nice things about Americans, and back and forth. Again, when you follow the Trump campaign, it's quite amazing all the signs that you see about Mexican rapists and criminals. How do you predict it will be different in 5 years, the relationship between these two countries, especially with focus on security relationship?
Well, nobody's going to jump into that frying pan, so I will. I think regardless of who prevails in the national election, I'm hopeful that whoever their Secretary of Commerce is, whoever their Secretary of State is, whoever their Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security is, because you really need to triangulate those three interests, are able to convince the president, whoever that might be, of the critical security and economic relationship we have, because I think it's been basically ignored. This is not a criticism of the incumbent White House, but I think he met 3 or 4 times with the Prime Minister of India, and that's a very important geopolitical relationship and a strategic relationship. I'm not sure we've spent enough time cultivating the relationship with our friends in South America writ large, but particularly our neighbor. So whoever prevails, if you look at it, it's the second largest market for export goods, which means there are 1 million or 2 million Americans exporting goods. I think you need the triangulation of interest, hopefully to convince the president, whomever that might be, it is in our national security interest and our national economic interest, because they're integrated, pay a lot more attention to the Mexican relationship than we ever have before.
I completely agree with that, and I would add, I think I'd look more broadly at South America and Central America. That is our hemisphere. And as important as it is to pay attention to what's going on in the Middle East and Asia and Europe, it's as important to look at the stability and the economic development in our own hemisphere, because that has a direct impact that, again, we often feel through the issue of migration.
How will it be different in 5 years?
It's never, first of all, as bad as it sounds, and especially if you're hanging around the Trump campaign. I'm sure you hear a lot of negative stuff, but I think it's going to be better 5 years from now. I think it's going to sink in even more to the American people that this, when you talk about Latinos in this country, you're talking about the second largest ethnic group in the country, who will probably be something close to 100 million strong by the year 2050. How on earth can you ignore ethnic population as large as that? So it behooves us, not only economically and politically and security-wise, but socially, to take into proper account the presence and the contribution of the Latino and Hispanic community in our country.
It's a perfect place to end. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. I know a couple of our panelists have to scoot off to airplanes, but I encourage those of you who are here, we have an amazing panel coming up. And in the meantime, I want you to watch this video, please. Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you.
The recent presidential election has had a lot of nasty things to say about Mexico. So, what do you know about the U.S.-Mexico relationship? Did you know 14 million American jobs depend on NAFTA? Did you know that Mexico is the #1 tourist destination for Americans? Did you know that 8 out of 10 avocados consumed in the U.S. are from Mexico? Or that Wonder Bread, Sara Lee, and Thomas's English Muffins are owned by a Mexican bakery? That more than 1 in 25 companies in the U.S. is owned by a Mexican American? That Mexico is the main auto parts supplier to the United States? Did you know 6 million U.S. jobs are supported by trade with Mexico? That Mexico is the 3rd largest trade partner of the United States? And a top export destination for 28 U.S. states? For every dollar of Mexican exports to the U.S., 40% is made in the USA. That Mexicans and Mexican Americans generate over 8% of U.S. GDP? That over $1 billion crosses the Rio Grande every single day? Did you know that more Mexicans leave the United States than migrate to the United States? Did you know that in 2015, 14 million Mexican tourists spent $10 billion traveling in the United States? All this makes you wonder, does Mexico really deserve all this blame? Because now, you know.
And you thought the Atlantic Council was a think tank. We're movie producers here. I'm Peter Schechter. I'm the director of the Adrienne Arsh Latin America program. And I want to say thank you to all of you for taking an interest in Mexico. Look, Latin America, we Latin Americanists tend to whine a lot about the fact that people don't pay enough attention to us, that why don't we get talked about in political campaigns? And boy, suddenly we were surprised when Mexico has taken such an outsized role in this political campaign. As Jason said, Mexico has really become the eye of the storm. And all of us who follow Latin America and who care about Mexico and about the region are stunned by how Mexico has basically turned into this poster child for all the ills that are ascribed to immigration and all the ills that are ascribed to free trade. So I'm really delighted to be able to moderate this panel with two people who are really experts in the subject. Secretary Carlos Gutierrez, thank you. You're a friend and a visitor of this center. As all of you know, Secretary Gutierrez was the former Secretary of Commerce, the former CEO and chairman of Kellogg, and is now leading a lot of the work with the business world on reconciliation with Cuba. He's the chairman of the Cuba Business Council at the Chamber of Commerce. And most importantly, he really is a voice of both expertise, reason, and passion on the issue of Latin America. And so we're always happy to have you here as a guest. Jay Shambaugh is a member of the Council of Economic Advisors. Chairman Jason Furman wasn't able to join us today. He was called into a meeting with more important people than us. And so we're really thankful, one person who's more important to us. We're thankful to have you, Jay, today. You're a professor of economics at and international affairs. So Jay at the council exercises a role on international and is a voice on international issues. He is a professor at George Washington University, has been a visiting scholar at the International Monetary Fund, and has been a visiting professor at a number of other American and European institutions. So thank you very much for coming today. Secretary Gutierrez, let me begin with you. And you know, there's been a lot of discussion in this electoral cycle about trade relations and the impact that trade has on the American economy. And you know, nowhere has that discussion been more acute than with Mexico, and in particular with NAFTA. And tell us, sort of think forward a little bit, and how is it going to be if our third largest trading partner is suddenly delinked from our economy? How is that going to impact jobs? How is that going to impact imports? How is that going to impact exports? What is the effect going to be on the consumer? Can you take us on a little bit of a tour? Get on a magical carpet and take us on a tour.
How is it going to be? It would be a disaster if we somehow cut trade relations with Mexico. It would be a disaster for us, for the whole, you know, Canada-Mexico triangle. You have, NAFTA is worth about somewhere above $1 trillion. And throughout the years, 20, 25 years, companies have been setting up supply chains. They've opened up warehouses in certain parts of this country, Canada, the US, Mexico, so that goods can flow readily. They've opened up plants in certain parts of each of the individual countries because that's where they get raw materials and they're able to ship and manufacture easily. So you have this infrastructure that is embedded that you can't just say, well, I'll just leave it there and go. So I don't, you know, in terms of NAFTA, I don't even know how you'd get started. And here's the thing. For a government official to say, you know, NAFTA's bad, it's part of my campaign, people are buying it, and they're going to vote for me, so we're going to get rid of NAFTA. Think about what you do to thousands and thousands of U.S. corporations who all of a sudden are turned upside down, and they probably have to fire a lot of people. They have to take some huge write-offs. They have to take a hit on their business. It's one of the craziest ideas, or one of the crazier ideas that I've heard, even in this campaign season.
Let me stick on the issue of NAFTA, Jay, sure. if I may. And you know, there's been a lot of anti-trade rhetoric, not only from one side, from all sides in this campaign. And you know, some have really impugned NAFTA as an example of everything that trade should not be. Can you how has NAFTA worked out? We're 20 years into this. How has NAFTA worked out for America?
So I think one of the really important things whenever people talk about trade policy is to recognize the difference between trade and trade policy, right? Globalization is something that is happening regardless of what we do, and trade policy, whether it's NAFTA or TPP or something like that, is in some sense how we decide to shape those factors that are going on. And so I think in that sense, it's not just the trade, it's also, frankly, the technological shifts. And so I think people often look to a time before a given trade agreement existed and think, well, were it not for that trade agreement, everything would look like that. And I think that's just not what reality would look like. You know, whether it's on a manufacturing floor, whether it's on how supply chains are set up, changes in information technology, changes in transportation technology, as the Secretary said, have just, you know, linked firms together in ways and supply chains together in ways that are very different from 30 years ago. And so it's not simply looking at the changes over time a question of NAFTA. I think what NAFTA allowed us to do is, as the Secretary said, link together more efficient supply chains across North America and integrate the economies in a way that really benefited a lot of people. Just on the really quick, you know, as an economist, the real nerdy thing that people will sometimes focus on as trade economists is this idea that one of the things that happens when you expand markets is the better firms do better. And that's important because the better firms are the more productive firms. They're the ones who pay higher wages. And as they grow faster, they employ a higher share of your economy. And so you get more people in those good jobs. You raise living standards. And that's, I think, one of the really important things through any of these issues that would raise the exporting ability of firms across all of North America, but in this case for U.S. firms, is it means good firms grew faster. They were able to export more, which meant they hired more people, and they pay on average about 18% more exporting firms than non-exporting firms.
Let me change this a little bit, Secretary. And in the previous panel, our moderator, Mary Jordan, had asked the national security experts what they thought of the wall, because she's the national international security correspondent for the Washington Post, but covering the campaigns. And so she mentioned, I think very interestingly, that she goes to a lot of the rallies and has seen a lot of people with placards and a lot of rhetoric about the wall. So, you know, there's two suggestions, which is one is the wall and the other one is the roundup of undocumented immigrants. And so we talked about the national security implications of these. Let's talk about the economic implications of both of these suggestions. I presume, for example, the wall would slow down trade, we would have problems with agricultural exports. I mean, walk me through a little bit what the economic implications of these.
I think the wall is a talking point. You know, it's like a bullet point on a chart that doesn't really mean much. The problem that we have to understand, and it's for me, it's at the core. The problem with immigration and the problem with illegal immigration is not that the wall isn't high enough. It's that our laws don't work and our laws are outdated. And I'll give you some examples. And this was the recent Senate bill that was going to be passed, which I believe is a little bit better than what we had. We have a quota for agricultural workers of 110,000. And if you talk to farmers around the country, they'll say we need about 1 million every year. Well, you can bring in 110,000 legally. What do you do with the other 900,000? Somehow they have to come in. Somehow you have to run your farm. So what's happening is they're either closing down, sending the farm to Mexico, or just, you know, selling a lot less. I was talking to a restaurant owner the other day. This, for me, just did it in terms of just visualizing it. He said, look, I have 3 restaurants. If I had more workers, I would have 5 more, because then I would able to, you know, I'd be able to resource and then I would hire more U.S. citizens as well. You have people like Microsoft. They can't get enough engineers, so they're building their R&D center in Vancouver. So it really is, it is a crazy debate because, first of all, it's broken because it's our fault. Our Congress has not done the job, and they have not updated laws that are 50 years old. We have quotas that make it impossible for people to run a business, that make it impossible for the private sector. So, you know, the other solutions are just, they're temporary Band-Aids and they're on the periphery. They're not getting at the core issue. And the reality is that if you take undocumented workers, their unemployment rate is lower than the national average, which means they come for one reason and one reason only, and that's to work. And, you know, just look around anywhere you see. I mean, it's just, we wouldn't be able to run the economy the way we do it today if we didn't have them. The problem is, as I think it was Chertoff who said, it's a matter of providing a system. Circularity, perhaps. They can come in, they go back home, they can come back in. They don't leave now because they won't be able to get back in. There is a way of doing it. And I think that one thing that we haven't tried that we should try is a bilateral immigration agreement where the private sector has to play a role and they have to have a voice. Because right now it's politicians deciding how many people the private sector needs. Imagine that.
Jay, let me. There's been a lot of discussion about immigrants, and I think the Secretary just was really very smart about looking at it. But I've heard the chairman of the council, of the President's Council, talk also about the issue of dwindling numbers of males in the labor force, and how that really is an issue that can have a long-term effect on the U.S. economy. And you've also talked about how immigrants can help mitigate the negative impact of this. Can you lay that out a little bit for us, and how that enters into this debate?
Yeah, I think one of the things, if you look just at the most basic idea, if you take the Senate bill that the Secretary just referenced, I believe CBO's estimate of that was that would raise output in the United States by 3.3% in the longer run. You may say, oh, that's just a number, it doesn't matter. Well, so I'm on the group that has to set the economic assumptions underneath the budget forecast. And I can tell you, we shed blood over the question over whether you raise or lower the long-term growth rate by 1/10 of 1%. If you told us there was a button we could push that would make output 3% higher in a decade, I mean, that would be one of the biggest things we could possibly do. It's one of the most consequential economic policy decisions you could do to lift long-run growth. And it connects to your other question as we look at whether it's declining labor force participation in prime-age males or whether it's possibility of productivity growth having slowed down. Immigration reform can make substantial contributions on both those facts. If you reform immigration right now, it has real productivity impacts because you get people into the right jobs. Right, so you've got people who are in the shadows right now who can't necessarily be matched to the right jobs. If you suddenly fix that, then you have much higher productivity. And so there's that side of it. Other issues, whether it's shifts in demography or labor force participation, put over time pressure on things like Social Security trust funds, and having common sense immigration reform can do a lot to fix issues like that as well. I think, frankly, also most studies that look at this find that wages for native-born Americans go up, right? And I think this is similar to your point about the restaurant person would hire more native-born workers as well. Those wages go up as well because you improve productivity, you lift economic growth, everyone winds up doing better off. And so I think it is one of these issues that lifting productivity is hard. Lifting economic growth is hard. It's not like there are 20 things on a menu that we sit there and say, I don't think I'll do those, right? This is one that people really don't argue over in terms of how much it would help. It would help a lot. You can argue over the exact magnitude, but it's big. And so it's something that would make a lot of sense to get done.
Just the point on demographics, which I think is a great point. And the numbers shift, so I'll use one of the numbers that I've heard, that you can grow an economy two ways. The number of people you have working and the productivity of those people. So if you stopped immigration and just said, let's let the workforce grow on the basis of who is here, I think the workforce would grow. I've seen numbers as low as 0.4, 0.5. 0.4, 0.5 is not enough to grow the economy. If you want to grow at 2% and you have 0.4, workforce growth, you need 1.5% every year of productivity. That's not easy. So it's a matter of numbers and it's arithmetic and it's very clear, but we definitely get sidetracked on issues that have nothing to do with solving the problem.
Well, here's another issue that we get sidetracked on, which is, and I'm asking you to put your private sector CEO hat on, which is, Mexico over the last 5, 6, 10 years has really transformed itself, and from sweeping reforms in telecommunications to the energy sector. And you've seen AT&T invest in the telecommunications sector. You've seen there's going to be a large bid for the offshore rigs that is coming in Mexico, and that's certainly American companies are going to be invested in. Part of the debate is also about, should American companies be investing overseas? Is that good for us? Is this globalized world? But I know this is a very simple, I think it's really important to take this on head on, which is, why is it good for America when AT&T invests in Mexico?
Well, because then AT&T has access to the Mexican market, which means that they sell more, hopefully means that they make more. If they make more, then their shareholders are making more money. They can hire more people in the U.S. They pay more taxes if they make money overseas. As we know, there are certain circumstances where they would pay more taxes to the U.S. But just put it this way, I mean, I've never seen or known of a country that has been successful economically and has sought self-sufficiency. They've sought to, look internally, and we're going to produce everything we consume, and we don't want to have trade. That would take this economy into a serious dive. So I think that's where the rhetoric, where the Trump rhetoric is so alarming, because if there are two things that have helped this economy for the last 200 years, it's immigration and it's trade. And those are the two things he wants to go after.
Okay, so trade. So let's talk a little bit about TPP.
Sure.
And a lot of senior administration officials have warned of the importance of ratification of TPP. Mexico is a TPP signatory, and TPP is the exact opposite of what many of the principal Trump and Republican recommendations are on trade. So I've got two questions. One is, presuming that we don't ratify, what is the effect going to be on Mexico? And what is the negative effect of not having TPP? And in particular, how does that affect the U.S.-Mexico relationship? And then talk about a little bit about what are the economic advantages for Mexico if we do ratify.
Yeah, so on the first one, which is one I generally prefer not to think about, but need to, if we don't ratify, I think there's a real risk to the U.S. In its relationship with Mexico, but more broadly in its relationship as a global leader with a lot of countries. And trade is going to happen regardless of what we do with TPP. And as I was saying before, the big question is, how do you want to shape that trade? How do you want to shape these economic relationships? What do you want the rules of the road to be? And TPP sets up a certain set of rules of the road. I think getting and to not ratify it after having exhibited a lot of leadership, getting those rules of the road to be put in place in Asia and across the Pacific Rim on this side of the Pacific, I think would just be seen as this massive failure of leadership. It would be very hard, I think, for us with any credibility to go to a lot of these countries and talk about any kind of global solution to anything. You look at the Mexico-U.S. relationship right now, and on a number of issues, the U.S. and Mexico really stand together in important ways. And so whether it's things like global overcapacity in steel and aluminum, which is a real challenge that we face in some areas where you've got some economies that aren't really operating in a market economy manner, and that distorts markets, and that's hard, and that's something that really takes some global cooperation and coming together. And it's a place Mexico and the U.S. have tried to work together on these issues. If other countries step up to pass TPP and we don't, I think you can just basically say we've forfeited our ability to exhibit global leadership on economic issues. On the flip side of what does it do, I mean, I think here's one of the ironies to me of many of the complaints, whether it's with trade or with NAFTA in particular. TPP in some ways is explicitly designed to take a lot of these things on, right? So labor and environmental standards are part of the core part of TPP. And so some of the complaints people say about NAFTA wind up getting fixed, whether it's the way investor dispute to settlement works. A lot of things that people said they would like to see in trade is what's in TPP. Right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is just, again, much like immigration reform, this is a button you could push that would make the economy grow faster. This is a way you could let high-performing firms export more and grow faster, improve supply chains, lift productivity. As you're saying, productivity growth is hard. It's not easy to get whatever productivity growth number you would need. If you have an opportunity to lift it in a way that is consistent with your values and the way you want to shape the economy, and in a way that is so important to your foreign policy and global economic leadership, it's very hard to see how you would leave that opportunity sitting on the table and just walk away from it.
On TPP, the point you made is excellent. We are very underdeveloped in Asia, woefully underdeveloped. We have, and if you take Asia Pacific, we have agreements with Australia, Singapore, South Korea. I may be missing one, but it's very slim. And the world is actually regionalizing. What's happening in Europe is actually counter trend. The idea that they may be splitting apart, or the UK, but Asia has a plan to regionalize, to make a regional bloc. Some people call it's RCEP, and people call it ASEAN +3, ASEAN +4, ASEAN +5. So it's the 10 countries of Southeast Asia plus, if it's 3, Japan, Korea, and China. In one trade bloc, without the US, and some people think that perhaps without the US dollar. So unless we're in there, 10 years from now, we run the risk of getting shut out. Our companies run the risk of getting shut out. And right now, as we speak, China's building roads coming down Vietnam, Laos coming. They're getting ready,
So I want to open it up to questions from the audience, but I'd like to end my questions with a question for you, Mr. Secretary, that's a little uncomfortable, which is, as a leader, as a foreign policy leader, as an economic leader, as a Hispanic, and as a Republican, why have the accusations against Mexico been so successful with a portion of the U.S. population in the last couple of months? Why has that seemed to have hit the mark?
Well, I would say they've been successful with a certain portion of the population, a certain primary voter, which is not the mainstream national voter. 11, 12 million voters, you're talking about a lot more if you want to get elected nationally. So I'm not sure that this is an argument that plays nationally. The way it was communicated was false, because it implied that the Mexican government is sending us their worst people. Wasn't that the accusation?
Yeah.
When actually, we are getting Mexico's hardest working, most adventurous, most ambitious, because they're willing to risk their lives to come over. So it was that concept that somehow the Mexican government is sending us their worst people, that it's false advertising, and he sparked a lot of people because of something that is absolutely untrue. But again, you cannot get elected in this country. I don't see the shape of the electorate to get elected without about 35% of the Hispanic vote. Romney had 27, McCain had 33, George W. Bush had 44. I doubt, even though Trump says he's going to win the Hispanics, I doubt it. So, I'm not sure it's been that successful.
Let me open it up. Questions, please. Let me start with the gentleman there.
Thank you. Mark Farmer with NAFSA, Association of International Educators. And I wonder if you guys could talk a little bit about the role of education in the economic relationship between U.S. and Mexico, and economic coordination, collaboration between the two countries.
If you have something, or I could.
Good.
Well, I think there are a lot of things that a lot of programs that go back and forth in terms of whether it's teachers or students where there's attempts at coordination and cooperation. I think it's a place where basically having NAFTA or having a free trade agreement that makes some of these flows a little bit easier in terms of education is important. I think, but I think the other thing is, honestly, I think improving education on both sides of the border is a crucial piece because, as I was saying, I think often people look at globalization and talk about trade agreements causing certain things when really it's changes in the global economy. And I think one of the things we know is that upgrading the skills, upgrading the ability to work with technology, improving the education standards on both sides of the border winds up being a crucial part to make sure that both countries are successful in the global economy. And so I think that's one of the crucial things. I don't know if there's anything.
Yeah, no, there are a lot of U.S. students in Mexico, and it's surprising how many Mexican students are in MBA programs here in the U.S. And, words are used on both sides of the border. Mexico City is like a big billboard for American brands. I mean, there's such intimacy between the two countries that it's on one hand ridiculous, but somewhat painful that we'd be talking about it the way we are. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we have to think about is you build a wall to lock out your neighbor. That's the kind of stuff that 10, 20 years from now creates revolutionary movements. But we just forget about it. And we're not thinking about what are we really doing and how is this going to be perceived 30 years from now. It just feels good because it gets an applause line and someone, may get the nomination because of it.
Other questions?
Hi, my name is Eva Marie Quinones, and I'm a student intern here.
Could you speak up a bit, please?
I'm just wondering that as the U.S. signs trade deals with our Atlantic and Pacific partners, particularly TPP and TTIP, do you think our trade relationship with Mexico will, in the future, decrease as well as our exposures to the Mexican economy, especially as gravity theory sort of falls by the wayside?
The short answer is no. I would not expect, so TPP in particular, say, to decrease our trading relationship with Mexico, frankly. We already have, obviously, a trade agreement with Mexico, but TPP goes further in a number of dimensions than previous agreements we have with a number of the signatories of TPP already. And so I don't see it. I think it's something that would make all of North America, US, Canada, and Mexico more integrated into the Pacific economy than they are already. But I don't think that would mean they would be less integrated in any way with one another. I think the common supply chains across the borders would be even more important, frankly, as you're then trying to, say, export to the Asian market. So I think in that sense, it's not something I would expect to decrease the ties at all.
Yeah, I agree with that. And Mexico has a border with the U.S., and that will never go away.
Yeah.
And that's an amazing asset. The other thing, too, is since the 1980s, there's been this manufacturing culture developed in Mexico, going all the way back to Deming's statistical process control and all those things. And it was taken seriously throughout the country. Mexican manufacturers are very, very good and very competitive. U.S. companies with plant in Mexico will tell you that that's probably one of their most productive plants. So it is a very good hub for manufacturing with a border with the U.S. I'd bet on that long term.
That gentleman there.
Hi, thank you for being here with the Embassy of Mexico. Why is it so hard to explain to people why trade is good. I mean, voices against globalization don't only exist here in the US, but also in Europe, in Mexico, against NAFTA too, all over the world. Why has it been so difficult for candidates and politicians to explain to people that trade is a good thing that benefits the general population, or maybe there are negative things that like have to be taken into account too?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll take a really quick shot at that and turn it over. There are 3 million jobs in the U.S. Some people say 3 million. The chamber has a higher number. Jobs associated with exports to Mexico. And you have to ask yourself, would those 3 million jobs be in existence, or would they be more or less if we didn't have NAFTA? The problem with trade is that if you look at the 3 countries and look at 25 years before NAFTA, 25 years after NAFTA, the 3 numbers are better, the 3 countries. It's remarkable. Anybody who's followed Mexico will know that before NAFTA, you had inflation rates of 60, 100%. You usually had a crisis at the end of a 6-year period. You don't see that anymore. I mean, it's been remarkable ever since NAFTA came in. So the problem is it's anecdotal. So I know a neighbor who knows a cousin who just lost his job because the plant went to Mexico. And it's true, and it's real. But the national numbers are better. So how do you reconcile that the national numbers are better, but some communities have been impacted? And I think there are things that we can do. We do have a program for trade adjustment assistance to help communities that have been impacted by trade. But the numbers are there, and the numbers show that that trade has been good, and NAFTA has been a tremendous success. Not for everyone, but for the country as a whole.
So I think the question as to why trade doesn't resonate as a positive force is it's a complicated one in a few ways. I mean, there's the old story about a person who moves to a town and builds a building and is able to suddenly sell goods in the town far cheaper than anyone thought. They think this person must have this incredible technological thing going on in that factory there, until one day someone opens the door and realizes it's just, a rail line going to a port, and they're bringing in goods from out of town, and people suddenly hate the person who they had loved before, right? And so why is it that we respond more positively to a technological shift that changes the cost of goods than we do to a trade shift? I think is not necessarily a question economists answer as much as sociologists, so I'll try not to. Other than to say, I do think one of the things is, people do get to vote on trade. They don't get to vote on technology. And so they don't always recognize the extent to which many of the shifts they're responding to really are technological shifts. Manufacturing output in the United States has not gone down. It goes up every year, right? Manufacturing employment does go down, right? In large part, though, that's because we get much better and much more efficient at making the stuff that we make here. And so I think we also import things, right? We export things too. And so when plants shut down because a plant is moved overseas, as you say, you see far less attention on the plants that are built here. Often that are, we export BMWs from the United States, right? People have jobs in that factory building German cars for export. Things like that, I think, do get lost. I do think one of the reasons is we don't necessarily do enough for the impacted workers. And I think there are a lot of things, frankly, that this administration has proposed over time, whether it's increasing the minimum wage to make sure that people who are dislocated and wind up in a new job are still getting a reasonable wage. There's a wage insurance proposal that was in the 2017 budget that I think was a really important proposal that made it easier for people to find a new job, and if it was at a lower wage, to get some sort of what we would call wage insurance for a few years as they build up their skills in a different industry. So I think there are a lot of things you can do that explicitly try to cushion the dislocations that do happen, whether it's due to trade or technology. In some sense, it doesn't matter why. Trade adjustment assistance, I think, is a really important idea, but because it's hard sometimes to say, did you lose your job to trade or technology, it often winds up being hard for some people to get it. And so I think often broad-based supports for people who lose jobs wind up being a lot more effective to make people have a more positive view.
You know, and I think another way of doing it, or one way to approach it, is company by company. To have the plant manager or the CEO or whoever go into the factories, the offices, and say, thanks to trade, this is what it means for our company and what it means for your jobs. I really think it has to be company by company, because it's hard to make a national argument.
Take time for one more question. I saw somebody with their hand raised here. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Gabriela Bolanos. I work for the Department of Agriculture for the federal government, but I have an interest also conducting research in one particular state from which I am from, in Mexico, Michoacan, because they are one of the top producers of agricultural products, and I know with the immigration, they are going to have a great impact, because currently they have about 40% of their population agricultural workers are here in the United States. That's what I learned recently. So with that, having that immigration program in place, or the agricultural worker in place increase, that is really going to take away some of their forced labor, and they are not very particularly interested in that. So my question is, does it really benefit the states such as Michoacan in Mexico to have such a program? And then the impact that Michoacan has in the free trade agreement.
You mean, does immigration to the U.S. hurt Michoacan?
Yes.
You know, it's an interesting question. In 1970, the average Mexican woman had 7 children. 1970. Today, it's about 2.2. The U.S. is about 2.1. And 2.1 tends to be, I don't know, you'd know this better, there's a number where it tends to be kind of holding steady. So there's going to come a day, not far into the future, where there are no Mexican immigrants, or there aren't enough as we need, because they also need the workforce, because the population isn't growing as fast. There's a big number of young people still, so Mexico has a lot of runway. But there's going to come a day where we're going to wish we had more Mexican immigration.
So let me end by just reminding everybody that on our website we have at #WhyMexico, we have a series of social media tools that you can use. They are educational tools. They are tools for all audiences, young, middle-aged, and older. As I learned from my colleagues who tried to explain to me some of the ones that were directed at the more young crowd. But I urge you to go. I urge you to use those tools. I urge you to spread some of the tiles on Twitter. Take a look at the video that we have and spread those around. I think it's important to use this event as a launch for an educational event that we will try to have for the next few months. I want to thank both of you for joining, and the previous panels as well. I want to thank my 2 colleagues, Rachel De Leviori and Andrea Murta, for having worked so assiduously and so hard on this. It's been great, and I think it's a really, really important cause. Thank you all very much for coming.
And you should have your